Evelyn Carter stood frozen in the middle of the courtroom, her late husband's battered briefcase clutched tightly to her chest. Her palms were clammy, her pulse racing, and every instinct screamed at her to step back, to surrender to the weight pressing against her ribs. But she did not move. She could not. Daniel would not have wanted her to. Across the polished wooden floor, Marcus Holloway leaned back in his chair, the overhead lights glinting off his expensive watch as he adjusted his cuff. He was known for tearing people apart. In court, for his surgical precision in stripping away their dignity, one smirk at a time. He had built his career on his ability to make the truth look like a lie. "No proof," he said now, his voice deliberate, measured. He was not the type to raise his voice. He did not need to. Just another desperate widow grasping at something she does not deserve. Laughter rippled in the back of the courtroom, quiet but unmistakable. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat, but she kept her gaze forward. She knew what they thought of her. A gold digger. A woman trying to cash in on her husband's death. She had heard the whispers, seen the glances in the grocery store, the way old friends hesitated before returning her calls. If they returned them at all. She exhaled carefully, pushing the tremor from her voice. "Your Honor," she said, stepping forward. "I have evidence that will change everything." A hush settled over the room. Even Holloway's smirk wavered, just slightly. Evelyn placed the briefcase on the judge's desk with both hands, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And to her, it was. The last piece of Daniel she had left. Judge Warren, a woman, in her 60s, with tired eyes and an expression that gave nothing away, tapped her pen against her desk, considering. "Proceed, Mrs. Carter." Evelyn's fingers fumbled with the latch, but she forced herself to remain steady. She had spent months preparing for this moment, enduring sleepless nights and bone-deep exhaustion, replaying Daniel's voice in her head, telling her not to give up, and she had not. Not when Victor Carter, Daniel's estranged brother, had crawled out from whatever rock he had been hiding under, claiming that the will was forged. Not when Holloway had shredded her character in pretrial hearings, painting her as a manipulator who had isolated Daniel from his family, and not when she had first opened this briefcase, the night before the trial, to find the letter her husband had left behind. She had not known it was there, buried beneath old case, files and receipts, tucked into a hidden pocket, like a secret too fragile to be spoken aloud. But the moment she had seen his handwriting, she had known. Daniel had seen this coming. He had known Victor would come for her. He had left behind everything she needed to fight back. Now, standing before a courtroom full of people who had already decided she was a liar, she handed the envelope to Judge Warren, her fingers trembling only slightly. The judge took it without a word, carefully sliding the letter from its sleeve. A moment stretched, heavy and unbearable, before she began reading. The silence in the room thickened. Evelyn did not dare to breathe. Then, this document changes everything. A collective inhale, a ripple of movement in the gallery. Victor shot to his feet, his face a shade too red. "This is a lie!" His voice cracked, his rage a barely contained thing. "She's making it up. This is a forgery." Holloway did not rise with him, but Evelyn saw the way his fingers curled against the table, the first real crack in his composure. Judge Warren did not look up. "Mr. Carter, sit down." Victor hesitated, his jaw working furiously before he collapsed back into his chair. His fingers tapped against his knee, restless, agitated. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that Evelyn would not have the strength to fight back. Evelyn did not look at him. She was staring at Holloway. He met her gaze, his mouth a thin, unreadable line. The recess was called moments later, and Evelyn walked out of the courtroom on unsteady legs, feeling the weight of her grief pressing into her ribs. Henry Blake, the retired lawyer who had stepped in to help her when no one else would, was waiting for her outside the doors. "You did well in there," he said, his voice steady. "Daniel would be proud." She nodded, but the unease in her stomach did not fade. She had delivered the evidence, but something in the way Holloway had looked at her, measured, calculating, told her that this was not over. And she was right. That night, when she arrived home, her front door was open. A cold rush of fear slid down her spine as she stepped inside. The living room was ransacked, drawers pulled open, papers scattered across the floor. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. Nothing of real value was kept here, except for one thing: Daniel's briefcase. She bolted for the bedroom, her breath catching as she saw the closet door ajar. Empty. Her pulse pounded in her ears. A creak from the back of the house made her turn, sharply, her hands tightening into fists. She was not alone. For a split second, she saw him. A man in black, faceless in the shadows, the briefcase clutched under his arm. Her grief turned to rage. "Stop!" she yelled, lunging forward. The man did not hesitate. He bolted. By the time she reached the back door, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. She sank to the floor, her hands trembling. The police arrived 20 minutes later, but she knew they would not find anything. Whoever had broken in had known exactly what they were looking for, and Evelyn was back to square one. But she had learned something from Daniel. There was always a backup plan. The next morning, she went to Daniel's workshop. The room was untouched, a thin layer of dust covering his tools. Her hands shook as she opened a locked cabinet. Inside, another envelope. She exhaled sharply, relief and determination flooding her veins. Holloway thought he had won, but he had underestimated her. This was not over. Not by a long shot. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, staring at the thick envelope she had pulled from Daniel's locked cabinet. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, thicker than the first, stuffed with more than just words, evidence. Real, undeniable evidence. She ran her fingers over the worn paper, her heart hammering. A part of her wanted to tear it open right there, to know exactly what Daniel had left behind. But she hesitated. Once she opened it, there was no going back. A knock at the door made her jump. She tucked the envelope under the pile of unpaid bills, on the table, forcing herself to breathe before she opened the door. Henry stood on the porch, a deep frown creasing his weathered face. "You okay?" His sharp eyes scanned her, taking in the tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion in her eyes. "They took it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The briefcase is gone." Henry sighed, stepping inside. "I figured." He rubbed, a hand over his chin. Saw Holloway's face when the judge read that letter. He knew then that he was losing. His voice dropped slightly. "So, what did they not find?" Evelyn shut the door behind him and walked back to the table. Without a word, she pulled the envelope from beneath the bills and held it up. Henry raised an eyebrow. "You are full of surprises." "I learned from the best." She slid the envelope across the table. "I have not looked at it yet." Henry hesitated, then picked it up carefully. "Daniel was smart," he said after a moment. "He always thought 3 steps ahead." Evelyn swallowed hard, So, let's see where his steps lead. Henry opened the envelope, pulling out a stack of neatly arranged documents. As he skimmed through the pages, his face darkened. Bank transfers, receipts, signed affidavits. His voice was grim. Victor was not just after Daniel's money, he was laundering it. Evelyn's breath caught. What? Henry placed the papers on the table. Daniel must have known Victor was using the company for something illegal. He must have been gathering proof. He tapped one of the documents. This is from over a year ago. He was building a case. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Then why did he not say anything? Why hide it? Henry leaned back in his chair. Maybe he planned to confront Victor when the time was right. Maybe he was afraid of what would happen if he exposed him too soon. His jaw tightened. Or maybe, just maybe, he did not get the chance. A cold chill ran down Evelyn's spine. Daniel's accident. A car crash on a rainy night. A tragic accident, they had said. No foul play. No suspicious circumstances. But now, what if it wasn't an accident? She whispered. Henry's expression was unreadable. Then we have a bigger problem than a forged will. Evelyn's hands tightened into fists. We take this to court. Henry nodded. We do. The next day, Evelyn walked back into the courtroom with her head held high, her pulse steady. Holloway's eyes flicked toward her as she entered, but for the first time, he did not smirk. Victor, on the other hand, looked even more smug than before. He leaned in toward his lawyer, whispering something, before settling back into his chair with an arrogant ease. Evelyn clenched her jaw. Let him feel safe. Let him think he had already won. The hearing resumed, and Holloway wasted no time. Your Honor, he began smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. This entire case is built on the word of a grieving widow who is desperate to hold on to something that does not belong to her. Evelyn stared at him, unblinking. He continued, pacing slowly, in front of the jury. Her so-called evidence is nothing but circumstantial documents that prove nothing beyond the fact that she is unwilling to accept the truth. Henry stood. Objection. If Mr. Holloway is finished with the theatrics, my client has new evidence that will directly impact this case. The judge gave a nod. Proceed. Evelyn rose to her feet. She did not hesitate this time. She handed the new documents to the bailiff, who passed them to Judge Warren. The judge adjusted her glasses and began reading. Silence stretched over the room. Holloway's fingers tapped once against the table. Victor's expression remained unchanged. Then, Judge Warren set the papers down. This court will take a recess, she said, her voice calm but firm. I need time to review this. Evelyn let out a slow breath as the judge stood and exited the room. Victor, for the first time, looked uneasy. Holloway, however, turned to her with that same cold smile. You really do not know when to quit, he murmured. Evelyn met his gaze, her voice steady. Neither do you. That night, Evelyn barely slept. Something did not sit right with her. She had delivered the evidence, and it was strong. Strong enough to make Victor sweat. But Holloway was too calm, too composed. She sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty spot where Daniel's briefcase had once rested, lost in thought. Then the phone rang. She hesitated before picking it up. Mrs. Carter? A male voice, clipped and professional. Yes? This is Detective Harris with the Seattle PD. I believe we need to talk. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. About what? A pause. Your husband's accident. Her fingers tightened around the receiver. What about it? Another pause. We have reason to believe it was not an accident. The world seemed to slow. Evelyn swallowed hard. What? What are you saying? I'm saying, Mrs. Carter. The detective's voice was quiet, that we believe your husband was murdered. Evelyn closed her eyes. She had known. Somewhere deep down, she had always known. When she opened them again, her hands were steady. Then, let's prove it. Evelyn sat at the police station, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the detective, across the desk. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper, the kind of place where the weight of untold stories clung to the walls. Detective Harris leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. We went back through your husband's accident report, Mrs. Carter. There were some inconsistencies. Evelyn's fingers curled slightly. What kind of inconsistencies? The damage to the vehicle, for one. Harris flipped through a file. The report stated that Daniel's car hydroplaned due to heavy rain and poor visibility. But the forensic team noted that the brake lines were unusually worn for a car that had just been serviced a month prior. Her breath hitched, he continued. And then there is the matter of the traffic camera footage. We pulled new angles. Just before the crash, another vehicle was following Daniel, close enough to tail him. A cold wave of nausea rolled through Evelyn. Whose car was it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harris exhaled slowly. We're still running a full investigation, but based on preliminary findings, the car was registered to a shell company. He hesitated before adding, one linked to your brother-in-law, Victor Carter. Evelyn closed her eyes. She had spent months thinking she was fighting a legal battle, fighting to prove she was not a fraud, fighting to keep what was rightfully hers. But she had been fighting the wrong battle. Victor had not just wanted Daniel's money. He had wanted Daniel out of the way, and he had succeeded. Evelyn's grief surged forward like a tidal wave, but she forced herself to stay calm. She could not break. Not now. What happens next? She asked. Harris studied her for a moment before answering, we need more. The footage raises questions, but it's not enough to make an arrest. If we move too soon, he could bury any connection before we have a solid case. Evelyn inhaled slowly. What do you need? He hesitated. Something that ties Victor directly to the plan. Emails, messages, a witness, anything that shows he ordered it. She exhaled shakily. I have something. Harris raised an eyebrow. You do? She nodded. Daniel kept everything. Her voice was steady now. And I know where to look. Evelyn did not go home that night. She drove to Daniel's office, the one he had kept separate from the main firm, the place where he went when he needed to think. It had been untouched since his death. The building was dark when she arrived, the parking lot nearly empty. She used her key to let herself in, her fingers trembling slightly as she stepped into the dimly lit space. Daniel's scent still lingered here, leather and faint traces of his cologne. She swallowed hard, pushing the grief down. Focus. She moved to his desk, running her hands along the drawers. The lock was stiff, but after a moment, it gave. Inside, everything was meticulously organized. Folders, handwritten notes, legal documents, and then she saw it, a flash drive. Her fingers tightened around it as she pulled it free. Heart pounding, she plugged it into Daniel's old laptop and waited as the files loaded. Emails, financial records, and then a recording. She clicked play. At first, there was only static, then a voice. Daniel's voice. Not going to let you do this, Victor. Her breath caught. A second voice. Low. Smooth. Victor. You do not have a choice, Daniel. Walk away, or you won't walk away at all. Daniel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. If you touch Evelyn, a laugh, cold, amused. I do not care about her. She is nothing. This is about what I am owed. Silence stretched. Then Daniel spoke again. You think money makes you untouchable. But one day, Victor, you are going to fall. The recording ended. Evelyn exhaled shakily. She had what she needed. The trial reconvened the next morning. Victor was smug when he walked in, his arrogance dripping from every movement. Holloway was just as calm as before, but Evelyn could see the strain in his jaw, the way he was clenching and unclenching his fist. They thought they had already won. They were wrong. When Henry stood and handed the judge the flash drive, Evelyn kept her eyes on Victor. For the first time, his confidence cracked. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played. Daniel's voice filled the space, each word cutting like a blade. Not going to let you do this, Victor. Victor's face went pale. You think money makes you untouchable. But one day, Victor, you are going to fall. When the recording ended, no one spoke. Judge Warren's voice was cool. Mr. Carter, do you have anything to say? Victor shifted, his jaw tightening. This proves nothing. My brother and I argued all the time. The financial records say otherwise. Henry interjected smoothly. Bank transactions, offshore accounts, and now a threat recorded by the very man you claim to love as family. Victor's hands curled into fists, and then the doors to the courtroom opened. Detective Harris walked in, and behind him, 2 uniformed officers. The breath left Victor's lungs. He shot a desperate glance at Holloway, but for once, the lawyer had nothing to say. Victor Carter, Harris said, his voice steady. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and pending investigation into the death of Daniel. Carter. The color drained from Victor's face. Holloway stood abruptly. Your Honor, I object to... Judge Warren raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Holloway. Holloway did. Evelyn watched as the officers handcuffed Victor, his expression shifting from shock to rage to something else entirely. Fear. You will regret this, he hissed at her as he was led away. Evelyn met his gaze. No, Victor, she said quietly. I won't. 3 months later, Evelyn stood in her garden. The legal battle was over. Victor had been indicted on multiple charges, and Holloway's career was in ruins. Justice had come, but it had taken everything from her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Daniel's letter. She had read it a dozen times by now, but tonight she just held it. Above her, the stars were bright, scattered across the sky like tiny, unshaken truths. She closed her eyes. I did it, Daniel, she whispered. The wind stirred, rustling the leaves, and for the first time in months, she let herself breathe.